là, on va reprendre en fait avec une chercheuse qui s'appelle Patricia Murrieta-Flores, qui est une chercheuse qui est basée à Londres et qui a été assez importante aussi dans nos réflexions quand on a conçu ces journées. Justement parce qu'elle travaille à partir des disciplines d'histoire et d'archéologie autour de la question de l'apocalypse et autour de la question de l'inconnu. Donc nous, c'était quelqu'un qui était assez essentiel, en tout cas comment est-ce qu'on a essayé de penser les choses collectivement pour ces journées. Sauf que malheureusement, elle pouvait pas être à Arles. Du coup, on s'est organisé autrement. On a fait une interview vidéo qu'on a édité pour que ce soit le plus agréable possible à regarder. Donc l'interview en anglais, elle est sous-titrée en français. On va la diffuser pendant une petite dizaine de minutes et ensuite on enchaîne directement sur l'intervention d'après. Donc voilà, vous pouvez lancer la vidéo, la régie. Merci. Je vous laisse avec Patricia Murrieta-Flores.
My name is Patricia Murrieta-Flores. I'm a Mexican historical archaeologist. I have worked for a very long time in a field called digital humanities. Digital humanities is an intersection between computer science and the humanities in general. So I did a specialization in computer science and particularly approaches of artificial intelligence, looking to solve questions in historical archaeology. So this is what digital humanities does. I'm a distinguished professor of digital humanities and artificial intelligence for Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico. And I'm also chair of digital humanities at Lancaster University in the UK. I have many different lines of work, but possibly one of the most interesting ones for this conference particularly is that of thinking about how specific techniques from computational approaches can help us understanding the different epidemics and diseases that happened during the time of early colonial Mexico. So this is the time when the so-called conquest of America happens, early 16th century. And how the arrival of the Spanish bring with them not only, themselves, but also 12 new different diseases into the Americas to which many of the indigenous people were not immune to. And this basically causes multiple epidemics across Mesoamerica. Now, it's also quite interesting in that line of work to observe that many of the studies of diseases in general have been approached from the Western European perspective, and this has many multiple reasons for that. But we are looking to decolonize history in general, and to think more about the perspective of the indigenous societies and how they actually approach issues of health, diseases, epidemics as well, and healing too. I think the approaches that we have developed, particularly with machine learning, aim to not only expedite the ways in which we look at the colonial archive, but also analyze amounts of information that was impossible to analyze before. So quite recently, we finished a really interesting piece of research, basically looking to teach the machine how to transcribe automatically calligraphies of the 16th century. At the National Archive of Mexico, we have 58 linear kilometers of documents. This is quite an exciting time in that sense, because we have been able to now create models that allow us to quite accurately transcribe these collections automatically. So to put that in context, what that means is that in the next few years, we will be able to do the transcription of millions of documents from the colonial archive. And this opens, information not only in terms of, volume, but also in terms of, for instance, social justice, right? So many of these documents were created by communities and groups that where this information has been taken from. And that, in effect, these communities do not have necessarily, the means or the education to simply, reach to these archives and to this information. And one of the main critiques that many people has, not only me, right, to this type of generative AI is that it basically draws from the known world, right, for the computer. And these models have been trained using, sources mainly from the internet, right, that draw from the global north, English material. And these are technologies also developed by white middle-aged men. Now, I will say that what happens with the colonial archive basically is mirroring, because we already know that the colonial archive is heavily biased in the same, in the same way as generative AI. We won't have the representation normally of women, of indigenous people, of any other alternatives, of discourses. We won't have children, for instance. So there are massive issues of representation, but also, I will say, of race, gender, and so on, right? So this is, I think, one of the reasons why, I wanted to say before, that doesn't replace the actual critical thinking that we need to do with, these wonderful tools that tend to have this wow factor, right, at the beginning. This is a beautiful question, Salma, and I think it goes at the core and the heart of the things that I want to do. What we tend to call the known, right, in the Western world, are basically either the epistemologies that we have generated or the epistemologies that we have adopted many times, swallow and stole, I will say, steal, yeah, from other communities and people, right? And one of the things that we are looking into, for instance, what happens in terms of the epidemics and what happens in terms of diseases that are introduced in Mesoamerica. One of the first teachings I think that I got from entering into that kind of research was precisely to realize that despite of being a Mexican archaeologist and educating myself in Mexico and so on, we still have a very Western education. And just realizing that the practices of medicine, of indigenous medicine in central Mexico, are completely different to those of the West. That means that they are usually invalidated, right, by the general, common discourse, either invalidated as, tagged with words and practices or ideas that do not really belong to the understanding of healing in indigenous communities, but that will also many times be tried to be understood through a Western lens. But in the case, for instance, of medicinal practices, in reality, we want to get away from these concepts, for instance, of medicine, because what we practice in Central Mexico is not medicine, is healing, and is a concept that is called tisillo. And Edward Polanco, for instance, he's a great scholar that has, written quite recently about this subject, has pointed out quite rightly, I would say, that we need to look at diseases, epidemics, and all these concepts really from a decolonial perspective. So one of the major difficulties that we have with this is that many of the sources, or the majority of the sources that we find, were written by colonizers, right? So it's hard basically to pull information from, a speaker for someone else, right? And particularly, that uses language like, this is sorcery, like magic, and these concepts that do not really apply to the concepts of healing, at least in the Nahua people in central Mexico. And so we need to understand what we call the practice of healing, for instance, the Siyot, and the practice of healing and healers in general, called Titisi, from a non-Western perspective, right? From a Nahua perspective. One of the things that happened precisely with the knowledge of plants, and it's very interesting, right, how that works, is that quite early on, even in the letters of Cortés, for instance, he says, right, when he writes to Carlos Quinto, he says that there are fantastic medics, right, in New Spain, that they heal with all sorts of, medicine, and he described them as, just fantastic. And so quite early on, the Spanish crown starts sending people basically to learn more about the plants and medicine and everything. But one of the things that happened, particularly, this is not only special of Mexico. I think in the whole of America in general, is that this information that is extracted from indigenous people, normally you will have it written, being translated to Latin, for instance, being explained, being given a name, for instance, to plants in Latin, and then completely forgetting that this information comes actually from indigenous people, right? Even many times berating indigenous healers, basically saying, things like, oh, they don't know nothing, right? But this plant serves to cure this, and that, right? And this happens quite often in many of the works. And what is really interesting about that is that then later on the medical revolutions that happened, in the 17th and the 18th centuries are actually thanks to many of the plants brought from the Americas. But it's incredible. And so these are, I think, practices that we still encounter, right? So I think this is one of the reasons why I love the topic of the conference. And to define the unknown, you have to have positionality, right? You have to define yourself as something. And so those boundaries, I think, particularly these conference being taking place in France, means that you will usually position yourself, as a European, and therefore what is unknown. Oh my God, there are so many things in terms of indigenous knowledge that can be thought about carefully to reverse climate change, to address injustice, to all sorts of different things. My proposal for that fellowship was to think about how we in Mesoamerica, indigenous people, experience the end of the world when, the European arrived. And we can talk about, conceptions, right, of the end of the world in many different ways, but it is quite interesting that even historical sources written by indigenous people like the Chilam Balam, this is a Mayan source, for instance, actually talks about specifically the end of their world, in the context of encountering the colonizers, right? So there is, I think there is quite a lot of room to take this concept of the end of the world and think of the epistemologies, for instance, of indigenous people, but also, conceptions of the city, the body. What I'm talking about is the profound disruption of cosmovision. So cosmovision are basically the shared practices that make us, unite in one way or another, the shared beliefs. The things that we do, let's say naturally, but in reality they are culturally learned, but that make us who we are, right? So make us recognize as some kind of people, right? So we have a shared Mesoamerican cosmovision. I have to say that we have to be careful there because we have, in Mexico, at least 68 indigenous languages, 168 different indigenous, groups. So we share some parts of cosmovision, particularly as we know it, at the beginning of the 16th century. But this is not to say that they are all the same and, that they are, believing the same things and so on, right? But one of the things that happened quite clearly and quite strongly, I would say, and quite violently, at the arrival of the Spanish to central Mexico, particularly with Nahua people, is the persecution of the practices of healing, for instance, and quite a strong push to change, the beliefs of why you get ill, for instance, how you get ill. The practices of healing in general are persecuted as superstitious, and as magical practices and things like that do not really correspond to what indigenous healers actually do. There is quite a substantial shift, for instance, in the ways in which healing, or what the European call medicine, is practiced, is just regarded and addressed. So, for instance, we have quite a lot of evidence saying that women were healers all the time. And the ways in which the Spanish priests, but also, scholars and so on, introduce women to the interpretation of medical practices in the 16th century is as parteras, so as midwives, right? Because this was the only role that women could have at that time, in the 16th century in Europe in healing practices, in medical practices, right? So they cage women into that particular role, when we know that in reality the whole of Mesoamerica had women as healers, all sorts of different healers. They do not only dedicated to midwifery, but many other types of healing as well, right? So this interpretation, for instance, has been reproduced all the time, and this to me is the end of a way of seeing women, for instance, right? Of thinking about women, of communities, allowing women as well to be who they were. We can talk about mini apocalypses, right? In this kind of practices that happen. And this happens not only, in healing practices and, what Europeans call medicine, but it happens in religion, this happens in language, this happens, everywhere, right? So there are many, many different apocalypses that I will say happen in the 16th century in America. And that they can be really harsh and abrupt, and some of them can be rather entangling practices, right? So, of course, indigenous people are very dynamic and very resourceful, and they are not static to these processes. They find ways of moving aside, moving along, moving ahead, moving below, behind them. So there is quite a lot of entanglement as well of practices. And we see that in the modern practices of healing in Mexico. This is really interesting to see, temazcals or, things that we call limpiezas, cleansiness, for instance. And these kind of practices come from different entanglements of beliefs. We still use, at least that have been recorded by the government, around 3,500 different types of plants, for healing practices in general. Around only 5% of them, for instance, have been tested chemically, with Western kind of like types of medicine to see the effects basically of those plants. But we are certainly in a lot of danger still about, biological colonialism, right? We had quite recently, I read an article that talked about how the US people, basically some researchers in the US are putting patents in plants, in Mexican plants. Yeah, colonialism is not over in that sense, right? So these little apocalypses are not over. I think, there are still practices that we identify and that we need to call out in order to not only understand these, ends of the world, but also combat them.